I'm Garrett Wymer, and thanks for joining us on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day as we spotlight the fascinating civil rights history here all across the Sunshine State and speak with many of those who are working to keep the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King alive here. And we start today by talking with Regina Phillips. She's the executive director of the Lincolnville Museum, talking about Dr. King's efforts in St. Augustine.
And just tell me a little bit about the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. What is it y'all do?
It is a museum that covers 450 plus years of Black history. The primary focus is in St. Augustine in Northeast Florida, but the history that we have actually is U.S. history because it parallels a lot of what was happening throughout the country. And it has some of the earliest Black history, African American history, stories of the country going back to 1513 before Florida was a state or the U.S. was a country.
And Regina, tell me about the state of the South before Dr. King and the civil rights movement really came into Florida.
So obviously we had gone through a period of Reconstruction following the Civil War, and then going up all, from that period, you started getting this encroachment of Black codes, Black laws that became the Jim Crow laws and the standard for operation in Southern states. It became not just, common law, but law that was written into our legislature. As a matter of fact, there were some nuns here in St. Augustine who were arrested for teaching Black students at a local school, the St. Benedict de Moore School. So those teachers were arrested and sent to jail, and took that case all the way to the Florida Supreme Court. And of course, they won. There were lynchings that were taking place throughout the state of Florida and throughout the country. There were also people that were just not being given rights as citizens, which they had gotten from the 14th, 15th Amendment. And those rights were being eroded, and people had become enraged because now property that they had, like in places like you talked about, you mentioned in your questions about Ocoee, where those people were burned out. They were forced to leave their land and not return. Their property was sold for pennies on the dollar. And there was this attitude throughout that if you were Black, that you were less than or not a full citizen of the United States. And we had only realized that as a people for a very short period of time. And people who had experienced it were fed up with people trying to take that right away again. So people were taken to the streets already before Dr. King and the SCLC came to St. Augustine. They were protesting here already. You already had people who had been arrested. You had the incident with the Moors who down in Central Florida who had been firebombed in their home. You had so many different cases. You had cases where the Klan walked freely through the streets of South Florida, even in Miami. And so, and in our nation's capital for that. So the situation was just where, like, we're tired, we're not taking this anymore. And it's not really that different from the day where people feel like their rights are being eroded, day by day, right in front of their faces, and that they are willing to take to the streets to let people know we're not satisfied with this.
And Dr. King, in some of his speeches and writings, called St. Augustine America's most segregated city. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of the mindset of the SCLC and Dr. King coming into St. Augustine and why they targeted that city specifically?
So a couple of things. They were invited to come by the local leaders of the NAACP that had not gotten the kind of traction that they were desiring from the local government. That the city was celebrating 400 years of, its history. And there was international press here from all over the world. And so when he was invited and he came and he saw the conditions where our city was asking for basically like a grant from the federal government to host this elaborate, celebration. And it was like Dr. King is saying, we don't want any federal dollars spent until we have access to certain things. So at that point, the city of St. Augustine was segregated. The majority of the people of color lived in a couple of different neighborhoods. One, Lincolnville, the community that this museum is in today. Another one was West Augustine, which is another predominantly African American community on the west side of the city, where we hope to build a new Florida State Black History Museum. So, two very significant communities that were engaged. The people were not allowed to eat at the local Woolworth lunch counter, so that became a big point of the protests. The sit-ins were because not because they just wanted a hamburger, but because if they wanted one, they didn't have the right to go and sit and eat it. They could cook it, they could buy it and get it passed through a side door and take it home and eat it someplace or on the street for that matter. They couldn't stay in a hotel. They couldn't go to a lot of schools and stuff that were here. Luckily, the building that I'm in had been built in the 1920s, so they did have a Black high school that they could attend, but it was a segregated school. So there were a lot of reasons that just the accumulation of all those things adding up together where people were just like, I'm just sick and tired of being sick and tired. So they sought out the help from the SCLC. They saw the work that Dr. King was doing, and I'm sure heard him speak about some of those things and invited him to come here. But what he found when he got here was a very segregated city where there were stories that about some of the elected officials that claimed that people were satisfied, that the Black populace was satisfied with the conditions that they were living under, where I've heard stories where people were standing in line in a grocery store and they were next in line. And if a white person walked up there, they were not waited on until after that white person got waited on. So that kind of discrimination that was dehumanizing for people, and the violence, of course, that had taken place in other areas was a part of why it was important that they came. But the biggest thing is they knew that they could get press if they came here as well because of the celebration that was going on in this city at the time leading up to that. So the protests grew. They didn't start when Dr. King came. They grew when Dr. King came and continued.
And who were some of the organizers on the ground that maybe, aren't as prominent, don't have days dedicated to them in St. Augustine, who really did a lot of this groundwork and inviting that entourage, like you said?
So you had several people. The name that is at the forefront of it is Dr. Robert Haling, who is has been deemed as the father of the local protest movement here. But prior even to that, you had Reverend Wright that was here several years prior to that, who was also head of the NAACP youth and who had, been engaged and ended up leaving because of threats against his family. You had people like the Eubanks who were here, who were, Golda Eubanks was a prominent minister who ended up being charged with a murder that he didn't commit, made headline news because of that. You had Mr. Chase, who was in one of the people, and Mr. Twine, who was also involved with NAACP, and all those people that were here, local leaders, just ordinary people who were just fed up with the system the way that it was. And the only way that they could see to bring about a change was to solicit help from people on the outside. But they were here. There's one man that's still here who was a very young person at the time. His name is Jimmy Jackson. He was 20-something-year-old, who was almost lynched by the Klan along with Dr. Haling and some of the other young people that were there, Mr. Clyde Jenkins and Mr. Huger. When all the things that happened in St. Augustine, the wait-ins and sit-ins and the swim-ins that got all the national and international attention happened, and then you had the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, You also, in the aftermath of that, had a bit of a brain drain to St. Augustine. A lot of the businesses that had supported the Black community, that were supported by the Black community, once people were able to shop in other locations, they lost some of their, loyal customers who were maybe not as loyal. Some of the ones that had customers that was diverse, not just Black customers, but white customers, local customers, that those people felt intimidated to some degree to go to those Black establishments anymore. So the positives of being able to go different places, live different places, shop different places, also had a negative effect that the people who had been a part of the community, the Black community infrastructure, those businesses, they were no longer able to sustain themselves, and a lot of them moved away to other areas where they could make a decent living.
And so when if I were to come to St. Augustine tomorrow, um, what are some of the things that still stand in regards to, I guess, what landmarks are there today of Dr. King and the civil rights movement that you think are most important for people to want to see?
So obviously, I'm going to say come to Lincolnville Museum. We have the arrest records of Dr. King. That's an unusual thing to say is your prized possession, but it's document of that preserves the fact that he was here and that he did was willing to lay down his life for this community as well, which we all know that he laid down his life for the entire country, but that he was here and that he made impact in this community in that way just by his presence of trying to have a meal in a local restaurant. He was arrested for it. It's not like he came and committed this, outrageous crime. It was just his being caused him to be arrested. And I think that's something that we have to be reminded of because, especially for young people, to understand that it was a crime just to be Black in America and try to go certain places. And that in itself is something that we just can't forget, that we can't allow it to happen. So many other things. Obviously, we have a lot of monuments here in this city. We have a foot soldiers monument in our plaza that talks about the civil rights movement that was put together by a team of people in this community, headed up by one of the women who participated in the sit-ins at the churches. They call them prayer ins. Barbara Vickers, she's still here in this community. She's 102 years old. She still lives here. You can go by a home here that's owned by one of the women who was like a den mother for Dr. King, Ms. Court Tyson's house. You can come on a tour of Lincolnville and visit some of the Accord civil rights markers here. You could go to the Accord Civil Rights Museum and see some of the other documents and stuff that were touched by Dr. King and some of that information that is there. But there's so many different reminders throughout this city, including, now we have a civil rights site at a local hotel where they had the wait-ins at Anastasia Beach, which is been deemed a civil rights site. And so there are a lot of reminders here of things that are related to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you've spent a lot of time. I won't keep you too much longer here. So, I guess just bottom line it for me here. What is, or what are the things that you would want our viewers to take away from Dr. King's time in St. Augustine and the civil rights movement in Florida?
I think to know that he was fighting for freedom for all and equality for all and an equal opportunity for all. It wasn't just about, civil rights, but it was about economic rights and all those different things. But human dignity, I think, was at the core of what he fought for, and I think that that's something that we seem to be losing a grip on to some degree. You know, it's you watch the news, you're there, you're involved with the news, that human dignity is something that we need to come back to, because in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, countries like Russia and Cuba used the Jim Crow laws to shame the United States about the treatment of African Americans in Alabama and Mississippi and other places that had to go to colored water fountains to drink water. And today we're talking about, taking away the right to walk the street. When I see people being asked to present their citizenship papers when they're out pumping gas in their car, that's the way it was during slavery and after slavery, where you had night watches of people who had to show ID in order to cross a bridge going to Miami Beach or Daytona Beach or St. Augustine Beach to go and work in some white person's house. They had to show paperwork to show that they had a right to cross that bridge. We are coming back to that day if we don't stop and take a good hard look at that and see what we're really giving away if we don't put a curb to some of these things that are kind of errant in terms of taking away civil rights and human rights from people.
Regina Phillips, Executive Director of the Lincolnville Museum, thank you so much for spending the time with me today.
Thank you.
David Nolan, a historian from St. Augustine, Florida, joining me now. And David, we appreciate you joining us here today to talk about St. Augustine's role when it comes to civil rights, because we know it has a rich history there.
It does. And, you know, it's too little known, but St. Augustine was the place in American history between Birmingham and Selma, Alabama, that occupied center stage. And the demonstrations that took place here led directly to the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. In fact, Dr. Martin Luther King went from St. Augustine to the White House for the signing ceremony for that very important law.
And let's talk about the site of a couple of these, major events in history there in St. Augustine. Talk to us about the significance of the Monson Motor Lodge.
Well, the Monson Motor Lodge was the brand new motel on the bayfront in St. Augustine in 1964, and it's where the media people stayed. And the civil rights leaders were no dummies. They said, if you want to make sure they cover you, go right there. And it was appropriate because the Civil Rights Act was the law that outlawed segregated hotels and motels and restaurants, and the Monson was all of those. So it became the focal point for many of the dramatic episodes that the American people watched on television every night. It became the only place in Florida where Dr. Martin Luther King was arrested. And kind of as a capstone to these events, there was what's come to be known as the splash heard round the world, where the president of the Florida Hotel and Motel Association poured acid in the swimming pool when an interracial group of swimmers were there. And that horrible photograph of that, which has become the most famous photograph ever taken in St. Augustine, it ran on the front page of the Washington, D.C. newspaper the day the U.S. Senate went to vote on passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So if anybody had any doubts, all they had to do was look at that horrible photograph and they'd say, it's time to pass this law. This is not the America we want.
And you mentioned the arrest of Dr. King and other activists as well that were held in the St. Johns County Jail.
Yes, indeed. In fact, a lot of people have heard of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail the year before, but many don't know there's also a letter from the St. Augustine jail. And he wrote it to a friend of his, Rabbi Israel Dresner in New Jersey. And he said, I know you're about to go to a meeting of the Central Conference of American Rabbis in Atlantic City, and I want you to urge the rabbis to come to St. Augustine and take part in our demonstrations. So St. Augustine was also the site of the largest mass arrest of rabbis in American history up to that time. So all of these dramatic events, one after another, as a historian, I love it because it shows how history is made. I think there were a lot of people in St. Augustine who thought, well, history is made when tourists come and pay to park in your parking lot and go to your gift shops and buy rubber alligators and t-shirts, and that's how history is made. It's not how history is made. There's much more storm and stress to it, but it was an event, the one time in all of its hundreds of years of history when the St. Augustine tail wagged the national dog, because events that happened here were seen across the country and around the world, and they changed America and they inspired the world to be better.
Talk to me about what has happened in the years since to that Monson Motor Lodge site.
Towards the end of the century, about 1998, there was a proposal to tear down the Monson and build something larger on the site. And I remember going down to our historic architectural review board and carrying a whole stack of books with me. I said, if you go to any public library in America and you want to look up St. Augustine, the easiest thing you'll have to find is the story of the Monson Motel during the Civil Rights Movement. And these people who sat on that board, I had known them all for years. Some were good friends, but every single one of them looked directly up at the ceiling while I spoke, refused to make eye contact. And there was one of those members, I remember later, anytime I went to a meeting, he would get up and ostentatiously leave. And if I wrote a letter to him, he would write refused across it in red ink and have it sent back. So it was the trauma to white St. Augustine lasted quite a while. And the attitude was, well, we can make the Monson disappear, and that'll make that history disappear. So it was a long battle. We spent 5 years trying to get them to preserve the Monson. And the city was just not interested at all. They twisted and turned every city regulation because the new builders wanted to put an underground parking garage, which would destroy the archaeological remains of centuries of history. And ordinarily they would say no to a proposal like that. But because this was going to destroy a civil rights landmark, they always found a way to let them go ahead. And then after the Monson was demolished in 2003, they went and they put 19 fake colonial buildings on steroids built on top of an underground parking garage, and they call it historic. Of course, it's not. It destroyed our history. And the city put up a historic marker there, which didn't mention civil rights or point out that this was the only place in Florida where Martin Luther King had been arrested. But those of us who cared, we were so sick of the destruction of the Monson that we went and continued. We put up historic markers. We have a permanently marked Freedom Trail now of about 30 important sites of the civil rights movement. And it's one of the few things you can do in St. Augustine for free. It's an open air 24/7 museum honoring the people who changed America and inspired the world.
David, why is it so important to have these things that are preserved when it comes to the history, specifically with the Monson?
Well, to me, one of the saddest things is when I visit another city and I see a marker and the marker says, "Here once stood," because that says to me that people didn't care enough, weren't wise enough to preserve what it was that stood there. And St. Augustine was very slow to come to recognize the benefit of the civil rights movement. Now that has passed now, our main downtown intersection has now been renamed Andrew Young Crossing after Martin Luther King's closest living associate, former Ambassador Andrew Young. So there has been a change, but we lost. I always worry, how much are we going to lose before we are wise enough to remember the importance of saving it. And this came up to me again last year during Black History Month, when the sheriff proposed to tear down the historic civil rights jail where Martin Luther King had been kept. And you know, back in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson was told, if you want to keep an eye on the leaders of the civil rights movement, just look at the St. Johns County Jail, because that's where they all are. And here was the sheriff proposing to tear down this historic building. So it pointed out to me, you know, I've learned over the last half century that there's no idea so bad that it's not going to raise its head in the next few years. So people all around the country who had been arrested during the civil rights movement and incarcerated in the St. Johns County Jail wrote to our county commissioners and said, don't tear down this landmark. And finally, at the end, they said, oh, well, okay, we'll keep it. You know, and ironically, this was at the same time that St. Johns County was fighting to get the state's Black History Museum located here in St. Johns County. And I said, how crazy can you be? You want the museum, but you want to lose the actual historic sites. So it's a never-ending battle. There was an old freedom song in the civil rights movement that talked about freedom is a constant struggle. Well, historic preservation is also a constant struggle. And as I approach 80 years old now and half a century of working here in St. Augustine, hope that a new generation will come along and cherish those landmarks and preserve them for the future, so that people don't come here and see a sign that say, here once stood.
So what's next then for the old St. Johns County Jail now?
Well, there were various proposals. I hope that the sheriff will move his office in there and will decorate it with photographs from 1964 that show the heroic acts of not only local people, but people from all over the country who came here to take part in the civil rights movement. And we will see, you know, you always have to be careful working with government bureaucrats because there's always a little way they can do this wrong or do that wrong, but we will be watching like a hawk.
And why, just bottom line, why that is so important in your mind to keep this history alive, even though it is on a you know, in some ways a dark period and some dark events that we're talking about that happened here. But why is it so important to remember those things?
Well, you know, I always think that in 1964, we were the stage for a great moral drama enacted before a world audience, and everybody played their role perfectly. Our heroes were heroic, and our villains were villainous, and they gave the world a history lesson that should never be forgotten. So it's important to keep these things up. I sometimes speak to business groups in the city. And I say, you know, how many people in the world have heard of Pedro Menendez de Aviles, the founder of St. Augustine in 1565? And you know what, maybe 1%, 2%. And then I say, how many have heard of Henry Flagler, who redeveloped Florida in the 1880s and on until his death 25 years later? And, you know, if you're in Florida, you've probably heard of Henry Flagler because half the state is named for him one way or another, a street, a county, this or that. And, you know, maybe 2% there. And then I say, and how many people in the world have heard of Martin Luther King? Everybody has heard of Dr. King. And here you're going to preserve sites associated with these people who are little known to the world at large, and you're going to destroy the sites associated with the most famous person in our modern history. It just doesn't make sense. I don't know how much I've gotten through to them yet, but I intend to harp on it as long as I am here to harp.
Still a lot of lessons that we can learn.
There are. And, you know, when I look back on all the years of work that I've done here. I think the thing I take the greatest pride in was the establishment of that permanently marked Freedom Trail of historic civil rights sites. I remember during the long years of the battle to try and save the Monson Motel, every time we had a public argument, the people on the other side would say, no historic significance, no historic significance. And I said, well, if we put historic markers in front of these places, at least they'll have to say something new, exercise their brains to come up with a new bad argument. So that Freedom Trail represents our answer to what destroyed the Monson Motel. There is indeed important history to say. It was St. Augustine's greatest encounter with modern history. It should not be forgotten. It should be honored and known more wisely. You know, St. Augustine has been described as the most important place you never heard of in the civil rights movement. And we are not used to hiding our light under a bushel basket here. So this should be more widely known. There were two great laws that came out of the civil rights movement. One was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that came directly out of Selma, Alabama, and Dr. King's march from Selma to Montgomery. That was 1965. But the year before that, we got the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that came directly out of St. Augustine. And we should be holding that banner high, letting the world know that this is the place where American history was made and changed for the better.
How can people learn more about the civil rights history in St. Augustine and the role that it played?
There is an organization called Accord that was designed to promote the legacy of the civil rights movement. And they have a website, accordfreedomtrail.org. And it describes the Freedom Trail and the many sites on it. And that would be a good place to go to start.
Historian David Nolan, we appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing this history with us.
Thank you very much.
Pleased to be joined by Gardner, CEO of the historic Hampton House. Curb, we really appreciate you joining us here on Fox 35 News Plus.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us.
So for those who may not be familiar, talk to us about the historic Hampton House in Miami and what the significance of it is when we're talking about the civil rights movement here in Florida.
The historic Hampton House is actually one of Miami jewels. It was actually back in the civil rights era, it was called the Social Center of the South, and also called the Cotton Club of the South. This place was the space where everyone stayed. It was a safe place. It was a Green Book Hotel. And the Green Book Hotel is a place where, when you're traveling north to south, it was a safe place to go, a place where you could stay. Obviously, in Miami back in the 40s, 50s, it was a place where Black people could not even stay on Miami Beach. You would have to leave the beach and go over town, find yourself in Brownsville, which is where we are. The hotel was actually built in 1954, the same time the Fontainebleau was built. In fact, Harry Belafonte opened the Fontainebleau, but he couldn't stay there. So he would come across town to stay at the historic Hampton House. But in addition to the musicians, Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, Cab Calloway, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, also to all of the important civil rights and social leaders were here. So from Malcolm X to Muhammad Ali, and of course, Martin Luther King, who we're celebrating his birthday on Martin Luther King Day on the 19th of this month.
And why do you think this was such a gathering place for some of those, those huge figures in that movement?
Well, because actually it was one of the only air-conditioned places that there were. Back in those times, many people like Martin Luther King, all of those celebrities, they would actually stay in the homes of people that were there, because there were no hotels that would accept Black people. And then, or the places that were, they were very small, had communal bathrooms, etc. So when this place was built, which was built actually by 5 Jewish men who saw the need, it was luxury that these individuals were accustomed to, and they could get outside of the South or outside of Miami.
So, what should people know about the role that the Hampton House played in these efforts, these
Oh,
important efforts?
it was a huge meeting place. For the for SNCC, for the SCLC, for gathering. Martin Luther King was often here. He stayed here. He actually wrote some of his "I Have a Dream" speech here, and he practiced it here. And there's an iconic picture of Martin Luther King in a pool here, in our swimming pool. It was also a place where that was safe for him. He could relax. But we had state-of-the-art facilities. As I said, it was air-conditioned rooms and a swimming pool. So that is really why they came here, because it was really the best of best that you could get. And even today, we still try to uphold that tradition, or hold that sense of excellence in the programming that we do. And as we take this institution, which moved from a hotel closed in the late 70s, early 80s, it was closed for decades, and then it reopened in 2015. We've shifted from being a community center to a museum of culture and art in 2021. And so that's really what we're doing as an institution, basically holding this history. We actually have a room that's actually dedicated to MLK, another room that's dedicated to Muhammad Ali. During the civil rights era, there was very few people, or well, that led the voices, and so those people stayed here. But obviously, they rallied people across the country for a movement that instituted the Voting Rights Act, the Housing Act, all those major legislation that was passed in the 60s. A lot of that happened. Those meetings, those conversations, those press conferences like Dr. King did happen here at the historic Hampton House. So it is legendary for what it meant, not only just for Miami, but also to in the movement across the country.
And that being said, then why is it so important to keep that history alive? You talked about operating as a museum and some of the things that you have going on there. Why is that so important?
Because it's important, because we are fulfilling Dr. King's mission. Our mission of the institution is to bridge racial, social, cultural, ethnic, gender, and religious divides. And so we take this history that's so rooted, that's a part of American history. This is not Black history. This is my history. It's your history. It's America's history. And we're taking this history, we open it up to the broader community so we can understand the fabric of America, and take that and make sure that some of the injustices that were done in the past, or if we educate ourselves about them, then they won't be repeated in the future. There's some interesting times that we are in right now regarding history and the access to it. And so it is our mission, it is our purpose. We're only one of the only institutions in Miami that does that, in order to get this message out and to use this history for conversation, use this history for good, use this history for purpose, to bring our community at large, not only here in Miami, but the state of Florida, the United States, and the world. And so our programming goes from in community here in Brownsville, based on our music programs. We have a swimming program, because during that time, Black kids are drowning in the pools. There was no place for them to swim. This hotel historically is always was a place where the markets would let actually community come here and swim. Kids in the community would come here and learn to swim. So there's a responsibility that we have to community, so we get that education out. Our art program, we've been involved with Art Basel VIP for the last 3 years, and have gotten some international recognition from that. We have a music program, our From Bebop to Hip Hop music program, bring artists back. So it's a place where we're taking that history and letting new people, new artists, build on that history. So it's important as we keep the institution alive, such that not only will current day generation will know, understand, and respect the shoulders in which their freedoms were built on, but we take current artists today, have them come back, and so that we can continue to build that legacy and history that I think is so important to the world.
When you think back to, like you said, Dr. King writing some of his "I Have a Dream" speech in that very place, I mean, that's that's hallowed ground in some ways to think about what happened there and the repercussions and the reverberations that were felt, around the world for years, for decades, because of some of what happened there.
Exactly, for what happened here, and the key is that. So we take that that history, we hold it to the highest of esteem. I mean, he did a speech that was done here in Miami, and he talked about how Miami needed to be concerned about um, how it was handling the immigration that was coming here, and also the Black people that were here that actually built buildings and roads, et cetera. And how it was a challenge for Miami to make sure that that integration take place fairly and equitably in community. So Miami is as diverse as it is. We still have work to do as a community to bring it all together. And we like to be that epicenter where those conversations can be had in a wonderful environment that holds this history. It's a sacred place. And when people come here, they feel it. And it's our job and responsibility to get that message out to the community. And we're doing our best to do so.
Curb Gardner, CEO of the historic Hampton House, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us as we talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement here in Florida.
Garrett, thank you so much. And thank you to the station that's helping us to be a better part of community and to educate the community of what are some of the gems that are here in Miami.
Elizabeth Grace, President and CEO of the Central Florida Urban League, joining me now as we talk today about Dr. Martin Luther King's visit to Orlando. Just to set it up here, before we get into that, Elizabeth, about where things stood in the civil rights movement in Orlando before Dr. King came here.
I think that the civil rights kind of movement, the progress, there had been progress that was then stalled after the assassination of President Kennedy. And I think some of the priorities were shifting, or it was not as urgent to move forward the civil rights agenda here in Central Florida at that time.
And that was frustrating to some. And so talk to us about how the visit came about, who reached out to Dr. King, and the reasoning behind trying to get him to come here.
Certainly. Reverend Jim Perry was associated with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he had gone to Morehouse College with Dr. King. And so he decided that he would reach out to Dr. King to have him visit Central Florida, visit Orlando, and re-energize, reinvigorate the civil rights movement here in the area, to meet with the mayor at the time, some also NAACP members, and advisors, community members, and kind of emphasize what the importance of the movement was, and how we should join together in advancing civil rights here in Orlando. And through that connection, that college connection, that clergy connection, Reverend Perry was able to reach Dr. King and have him come and visit Orlando area.
And so what did that visit look like? What all did that involve, and where did Dr. King go?
So he definitely went to Shiloh Baptist Church, which still is an important church here in the Orlando area off of South Street. He met with NAACP members. And again, as I mentioned, he met with the mayor, Bob Carr, at the mayor at that time, to talk about what it looks like for civil rights to be truly enacted. Also, the constituency. This is something that was needed, that was wanted by the people of Orlando, and the repercussions of the benefits that would take place here in our community by advancing civil rights.
And the speech at Tinker Field, what was the significance of that?
As far as I know, that was the only time that Dr. King spoke in Orlando in Central Florida. You certainly can correct me if I'm wrong on that fact. But it was important because you had a galvanizing figure like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to come to our area and talk on the mound of Tinker Field, which also, had some implications as far as segregation in the baseball and the sports arena. And to talk about how now is not just the best time, but really the only time, the urgent time to move forward with the advancements of civil rights. So it was extraordinarily important because he came specifically to address our geography and our locale and our needs as citizens of this community.
Our understanding is that there were some threats of violence ahead of that speech at Tinker Field as well.
Yeah, I certainly, yes, that is true. I think what is an unfortunate thing to understand is that a lot of times, in advance of many speeches, in advance of civil rights or well-known, nationally known figures, there were always threats of violence and this kind of presence of danger. And that is what is partially so important is uh, that Dr. King faced that all the time, and that our local leaders faced that. You certainly have Harry Moore and Harriet Moore, who out of MEMS, who not just faced threats of violence, but were victims of violence. And so that was part of something that was inherent in that movement. But you had these people who still spoke truth to power anyway, though they were threatened, though they were, letters or what have you, threats of violence, they still came and spoke and tried to move forward a common beneficial agenda, no matter what they faced.
What did Dr. King's visit here do for the civil rights movement in Orlando?
I think by being able to meet with the mayor and involving our Black community leaders at the time, I think it really moved forward the needle. It helped the mayor who had those powers to speak on behalf of, make policy on behalf of, enact laws on behalf of Orlando to move forward that agenda and to enact things that would be beneficial, civil rights that would be beneficial to the entire community. And I think so. I think it was very pivotal. I think it was extraordinarily important that he came and was able to meet and able to speak and address a larger audience.
What's the legacy of Dr. King in Orlando?
The legacy of Dr. King in Orlando, I will say I am privileged to be a member of the City of Orlando Mayor's MLK Commission. And every year we visit what that legacy of Dr. King is. And there are certain events that happen around that. But to me, it is still that progress through nonviolence, through coalition building, through meeting, through collaboration, through partnership to advance the things that will be important, not just for one area of the community, but for the community at large. So I still think that we are living Dr. King's legacy. We are trying to bring forward the things that he held important and that he spoke on behalf of here every day. And I think it is the physical monument at Tinker Field, the timeline, that's worth visiting because it speaks to the fact that justice and equity, equality takes time, and it takes a great many people to move it forward.
Yeah, let's talk about that, the plaza there, and why that is, you think, is such an important kind of aspect, an important thing to have, so that people can learn more about the history.
I'm a big proponent of physical and tangible reminders so that we are not having to rely on the spoken word or the stories that are passed down from one person to another. I certainly think storytelling has an important place, but to have a physical and tangible monument that anyone can go visit at any time is important because it makes the information accessible to everyone, whether you are here as a resident or visiting or attending an event over at Tinkerfield. It is important that that monument is there, that it is accessible to anyone at any time, so that if you're wanting the information, there's an easily accessible place for you to get it.
And still things we can learn today.
Absolutely. I think learning never stops, right? No matter how much we study and do research, we're always learning and hopefully using our knowledge for the betterment of our community.
Elizabeth Grace, President and CEO of the Central Florida Urban League, we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
One of the ways that we continue to honor Dr. King on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day is with parades all around the region, all across the country, including downtown Orlando. We had the chance to speak with Dana Mackey, president of the Southwest Orlando Jaycees, about their honors for Dr. King on this day.
We're an organization that was built from community, right? So this started a long time ago so that we can get ourselves together as a people to move forward. So we just started to just empower our community to do greater and better things, to be involved in the civic and community events.
And then, so how many years have y'all been putting on the Dr. King parades in Orlando?
This is our 42nd annual downtown Orlando Martin Luther King Day Parade.
42 years. How many have you been a part of specifically?
I have been a part for 9 years, 4 years as the president.
4 years as the president. So what has changed in organizing this parade, I guess, from being more of just a member participant versus being the president and really being the one to kind of put everything together?
The change is the amount of people that know your phone number. So actually, the change, you become more like deeply ingrained in the process and understanding what it takes to put on and how much it takes to put on a parade of this size.
And then can you just talk to me a little bit about Dr. King's legacy in Orlando and the civil rights movement altogether, and really trying to honor his memory with this parade?
Yeah, I think one of the most things that he pushed and drove was uniting the nation a nonviolent way, right? And our theme this year is Mission Possible 2, building a community, uniting a nation the nonviolent way. And I think that's very important for everything that's going on politically around our nation today, right? Like, we have to figure out how to come across the aisle. We have to figure out how to engage each other with just civil conversations versus just, brash and brutal conversations, right? We have to find the middle. And I think this theme is going to hit the point.
So what are some of the challenges in putting together the parade like this every year? Does it get easier? Does it get harder? Is it just different?
So every year has its own challenges, right? Like, remember the COVID year, we had to go from a traditional parade and we had to do it at the Dr. Phillips Center in a showcase type arrangement. We had, I think 2 years ago, when there was mass shootings that were happening. So we had to curtail it a little bit. So every year is a little different. The biggest hurdle is fundraising. We're a nonprofit organization. Everybody that works for our organization also has a full-time job. We don't take any, checks or money from this. So whatever we, people always say, hey, the costs are high. And the reason that they are a little elevated are because we have to pay fees to the city for permitting and the police for protection. You have to use the restrooms. We have to bring porta johns in. So there's a lot of fees that go into putting on a parade this size. So I think the biggest hurdle is just raising funds.
You talk about all these hurdles. This is your fourth or your fifth year?
This is going into my fifth year. Yes.
What keeps you coming back? What keeps you wanting to jump back in and continue to organize this parade?
I'll tell you, passing the torch. When I grew up in Miami, and when I was in Miami, I'm the oldest of seven. So my teachers in the community gave so much to me. And as I always look back, I always wanted to give back. And this is a way for me to give back to the community, to stay involved, and to just keep passing that torch. And hopefully someone can look at me and say, you know what, I want to do the same thing. I want to join the organization so that I can give back as well.
And we talk about the theme Mission Possible too, right? Where does that come about? How do these, I guess, parade themes come from, and what really is the goal of giving this theme and kind of uniting everyone under that one banner?
So we get the theme from the King Center. So we try to stay nationally aligned with King's message, right? So we use that message every year to stay aligned. We could go rogue and use our own theme, but we want to stay banded together. And I think that's something that has gone awry in the last, decade or so is trying to stay together as one.
What makes this year's Orlando Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day Parade, what makes this year special?
Well, I would tell you a couple things that's going to make it special. Mabel Butler passed away earlier last year, or let's take that one over. So I'll tell you what will make it special. Mabel Butler passed away, and she usually closes out our parade, and she's not going to be there this year. And it is going to be something that I'm really going to miss. I really miss her smile and her, hugging. Other than the history behind her, she as a person is going to be missed. So this year we're going to close out the parade the same way we usually do, but we're going to dedicate the vehicle. We're going to have her picture, Mabel Butler, and she will always be represented when closing out the end of the Orlando Martin Luther King Parade. So that is going to be probably one of my most memorable moments of this year in 2017. Looking forward to that because that one hit me a little hard.
And when we talk about the timeline of Dr. King's life, a lot of the people who marched with him, who spent time with him, they're getting up there in age. A lot of them are, 90s, 80s, 90s. Some of them are even over 100 when you look into South Florida. You talked a lot about passing the torch. How, I guess, looking ahead to kind of that transition, what do you think is important to take from the people who spent time with Dr. King when they may not be around for much longer?
Man, that's a great question. I think we have to take from them their work and their consistency of trying to keep us together, keep the message alive, and keep the fight alive and bring people along with us. I think we're in a non-complacent state right now where people understand and realize what's going on behind them and around them and to them. However, they're not getting involved, right? And I think we need to push and pull on each other. You bring one to the table, I bring one to the table, because it's not going to happen by the mass messaging, right? We have to personally reach out, and we have to go back old school, right? And get our feet on the ground, and just bring one, because right now the messaging has changed. People are kind of tone deaf to what's going on in our world right now. And I think we need to get back to that personal one-on-one conversation. And going back to your question is, we just got to put in the work. That's what I take from everyone that's worked with Dr. King. We have to put in the work and rally our community, and we have to do it in a different way than we've been doing it, because what we've been doing isn't working.
To bottom line it for me here, Dana, if someone's coming to the Orlando parade who really hasn't heard much of Dr. King besides what they learned in school, what would you hope they take away from attending the celebration?
Community and pride, right? It's all about community and pride. When you come down to the parade, you're going to see smiles, you're going to see kids, you're going to see the city, the county, you're going to see businesses, you're going to see all people of all walks of life down to celebrate Martin Luther King's legacy. It's just a beautiful thing.
Thanks for joining us as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today and take a look at the civil rights history here in the Sunshine State. You can watch our live streaming Fox 35 News Plus and Florida Live coverage daily on Fox Local.